La da 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 da. La da 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 da. Hello! It's very cold again outside. I've actually been there, you can see, and having a little bit of fun in the snow. That being said, it's so cold out there. There's no reason to go outside at all. What am I going to do with the rest of my day? I decided to make another YouTube video. Today's video, we're going to do all sorts of really cool things. Again, it's another how-to sort of video. Among other things, we are going to juggle more than really 200 years, nearly 250 years of Brazilian history. We're going to do it in 45 minutes again, 50 minutes tops. It's another how-to sort of video. How do you juggle? Well, I juggle like this. Woo! But you can juggle however you want. Just stay warm. Holy cow! What in the world? Woo! Oh, the things you find. I was trying to bribe my kids again to come watch, and I think they're all history out. You may be history out too. Well, as I said, today we're going to look at really 250 years of Brazilian history, and we're going to be juggling a lot of different things. To begin, again, I want to take you to the syllabus and give you a chance to get a sense of where we are really, and then we'll move from there to Brazil. And something to note, right now in Brazil, it is the middle of the summer. It's very warm, very hot, and so let's leave our -10, our -15, our -20 degrees behind, our freezing wind chills, and go off to the coasts of South America. All right, I want to take you here so you can get a sense of the syllabus just very quickly. As you can see, previous to this, on Monday and Wednesday, we did Captivity and Redemption, Abolition in San Domingue in the British West Indies. We looked at the case of Haiti. We looked at the case of the British West Indies. We're continuing now with 3 lectures, really 2 lectures and a discussion that changed the focus to the Portuguese world, to Brazil. Today we'll do the coming of independence in Brazil. On Monday we'll do the coming of abolition over the course of the 19th century. And then on Wednesday you'll have 2 short stories to read. I'll send you out an email with additional information about the short stories as at the point that you're getting your papers to me, so that you don't feel too overwhelmed. But neither of these are very long. They're both fictional pieces that were written in the 19th century, both treating slavery in some manner. So 2 short stories that speak to the slavery of the 19th century in Brazil. So that kind of gives you a sense in terms of where we are. Again, we're dismantling the empires that we established over the course of the first part of the course. Now we're moving to do this in the case of Portuguese Brazil. Now, in terms of today's lecture, just like last time, there are going to be a bunch of different terms that I would normally put up on the board. Here you can see them laid out before you right now. The lecture itself is called Regents, Kings, and Emperors, Brazil's Peculiar Path to Independence, and here you've got all of the terms laid out for you here. I suggest that you pause for just a moment, pause the video so that you can write all of these down. Again, just like last time, I'll have these appear as we move forward with the lecture. In prefacing my remarks today, I want to just comment on the fact that in the case of Brazil, abolition and independence are very much different than the cases that we've previously studied, specifically Haiti and the British West Indies. And yet, events in Brazil are very much tied to the larger Atlantic world, and more specifically to the larger French and British worlds that we've previously talked about. And in this regard, I'd encourage you over the course of today's lecture to really make connections between what we're talking about in Brazil and what we previously talked about in the British West Indies, in Haiti as well. Look and try to find the connections. Think about how these earlier events can be used to interpret what happens ultimately in Brazil. Again, Brazil is influenced by events elsewhere, events in San Domingue, events in Europe, events in the British West Indies. Well, where did we last leave Brazil? We last left Brazil lectures and lectures ago in the middle of the 17th century, the middle of the 1600s, when we were talking about the establishment of sugar plantations. And we left the Dutch and the Portuguese, as it were, vying for control of the coasts of northeastern Brazil in order to make their profits through sugar. That was a long time ago. In terms of the class, in terms of going forward today, in the decades that followed, Brazil would be further and further transformed. And you really see this in many ways at the end of the 17th century, in the middle of the 1690s, when large quantities of gold are discovered deep in the interior of Brazil. The discovery of gold will completely transform the history of Brazil in many ways. The 18th century that follows comes to be known as the Golden Age of Brazil. Gold will become of primary importance to the Brazilian economy, more especially to the larger economy of Portugal and of the Portuguese Empire. I'll show you in just a bit where gold is being found and so forth, give you a quick sense of this. A point I want to make in all of this is that gold will become an important point of negotiation, of colonial negotiation, between the Portuguese crown and the inhabitants of Brazil. The inhabitants of Brazil are becoming wealthy with gold. The crown, of course, is becoming wealthy as well. And the question is, how much, of course, is the crown allowed to tax? Who does the gold ultimately belong to, and so forth? Gold will become a point of colonial negotiation. Well, we don't have a lot of time here, but I just want to give you a quick sense of Brazil's golden age. Late 17th century, the 1690s, gold is found in large quantities in the interior of Brazil, particularly in this region here that's known today as Minas Gerais. And so gold is found here. The chief town of this region will come to be called Vila Rica do Ouro Preto, the rich town of black gold. Ouro Preto is how I'll abbreviate it during today's lecture, but it's right here. This is the chief mining area. The gold is later found out here in the 1720s, out here also in the 1720s, way out here in the 1730s. The 18th century, the first half of the 18th century really, comes to be Brazil's golden age. In terms of the mining itself, here's an image. You can see it's what's called placer mining. It's very similar to the mining that went on in the 19th century in California. Basically, you're panning for gold. It's in the rivers and the streams. You can see that here. A difference, an important difference, if you look at this, you can see the mining itself is all being done by African slaves. And so slavery will become very important in the interior of Brazil in these mining regions. Beyond gold, other things are being found as well. Here are just some quick images that give you a sense of diamonds. And these are slaves that are washing diamonds in a stream in the northern part of Minas Gerais. You can see each one is supposed to have an overseer to make sure they don't do anything with the diamonds that they're not supposed to. This fellow right here, he's had a long day. Here's some other images of the diamond district. And so forth. A big question in all of this is what happens to the gold? Well, lots of people are enriching themselves with the gold. This is particularly the case of the Portuguese crown. And the Portuguese crown will build things with it in Europe. This is the Joanine Library at the University of Coimbra. It's built during the first half of the 18th century. It's built with the proceeds from the taxes that the crown collects. It's not just the proceeds, though. It's built with the gold itself. You go inside, everything is gilded. And you can see that here laid out for you. Just a beautiful, beautiful library. A couple other images of the Joanine Library here. Just a lovely place. You can imagine studying there. Palaces are put up. This is the National Palace of Mafra in Mafra, Portugal. It's built over a period of decades in the 18th century. It's huge. From one end to the other is like 300 yards. It's just this huge monstrosity planted down in this little Portuguese town built by the Portuguese kings with Brazilian gold. So another image here to give you a sense of just the size of the National Palace of Mafra. Mafra is just one example. Lots and other palaces, churches, all sorts of things are being built with the proceeds of Brazilian gold. The crown is very much enriching itself off of this new world colony of Brazil. Well, I want to come back to a point that we were looking at just a moment ago, and that is the question of gold as being central to colonial negotiation. Negotiation between the center of the empire, the Portuguese crown in Lisbon, and the people who are finding the gold, these miners in the interior of Brazil. Brazilian-born elites, as they find more and more gold, as they become wealthier and wealthier, will come to have real political and social grievances against the Portuguese crown, recognizing in many ways that their own personal interests are fundamentally different than their counterparts in Lisbon. By the middle of the 18th century, because of the profitability of Brazilian gold, the economic survival of Portugal will depend almost entirely upon Brazil. These elites in Brazil become very much aware of this fact, but of course so does the Portuguese crown. The royal ministers in Lisbon are very much aware of it as well. They begin to worry. What would happen if there was some form of independence coming to Brazil? And you really see this early on. A comment is actually made in the 1730s in a letter that was written to the Portuguese crown by one of the crown's counselors, Antonio Rodrigues da Costa, in 1732. Shortly before his death, he's been a royal minister for a lengthy period of time. He writes to the crown and he warns about the heavy taxes that the Portuguese crown is levying upon the mining regions of Brazil. He writes, "It is obvious that if Brazil is placed in one scale of the balance and Portugal in the other, the former will weigh far more heavily than the latter, and consequently the larger and the richer will not consent to be ruled by the smaller and the poorer." Now, he writes this in 1732 to the crown. That being said, independence, what he's describing, the coming of independence, will not come for nearly another century. And one of the main questions I want to address today, and I want you to think about this question interpretively, why does it take so long for independence to come to Brazil? So that's our question. We're going to address it in all sorts of different ways. I'm going to give you some interpretive ideas as to why this is the case. And a point I want to make to begin with in terms of this question is independence doesn't come, but in many ways it's not for a lack of trying. There's all sorts of unrest in Brazil, really during the second half of the 18th century. And a prime example of this unrest can be found exactly in the mining regions that we've talked about. Let's go to our map. Let me take you to Ouro Preto, Brazil in the 1780s, the center of these mining regions, the capital of Minas Gerais. And here on our map, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Again, Minas Gerais is right here. The capital of Minas Gerais, Vila Rica do Ouro Preto, often just simply abbreviated as Ouro Preto. This is the setting for the story I'm about to tell. Well, in the late 1780s, in Ouro Preto, the capital of Minas Gerais that I've shown you on the map, in the late 1780s, a group of people begin to conspire to establish an independent republic in the very heart of South America. Today, this is referred to in English as the Minas Conspiracy. In Portuguese, you'll see it referred to as the Inconfidencia Mineira. And it begins to be planned really in 1788. At this point in time, a newly arrived governor in the region is imposing a new tax, a tax that's attempting, again, to help the crown take advantage of all the gold that's being found in the region. The locals don't want to pay it. They begin to conspire. The conspiracy includes many of the elites in the town. It includes others as well. Among the conspirators is a dragoon corporal, a man whose full name was Joaquim José da Silva Xavier, but who goes by the nickname of Tiradentes. And in Portuguese, and you can see how I've spelled Tiradentes there, it's a little bit different maybe than it might sound to your ear. The cha is how you do a ti in Brazilian Portuguese. But Tiradentes was a dentist. In addition to being a dragoon corporal, he was a dentist. He essentially pulled people's teeth, and that's literally what Tiradentes mean, to take out a tooth. So he's a dragoon corporal, a dentist. He and various others, elites, some intellectuals as well, in Ouro Preto begin to conspire. And they develop a plan to rebel, to declare independence, to establish an independent republic in the middle of South America, the middle of what is today Brazil, modeled after the United States. They've got an example already. This has already happened in North America. They're modeling their ideas on what happened with the 13 colonies, what would become the United States. Again, they were particularly upset about a head tax that was to be enforced by the region's new governor, who wanted, again, to basically collect the gold that they're finding in the interior. Well, they deal with a bunch of questions, like any conspiracy would. And one of the main questions they have to deal with is the question of slavery. Some of the leaders of this conspiracy want to abolish slavery, others do not. In terms of the questions, the concerns, they're particularly concerned that slaves might be armed and promised their freedom by the government if they fight against the conspirators. What do? Well, eventually the conspirators compromise. They agree that in their conspiracy, slaves that have been naturally born in Brazil will be free. African-born slaves, however, are going to remain in servitude. In this regard, it bears noting that the conspirators' notions of liberty and independence were very, very conservative. Their rebellion is planned before the French Revolution. They don't have a radical model to draw on. They have a much more conservative kind of model, a North American model. They want to change the political structure in Brazil, but they want to do so without social upheaval. Well, this is their plan. The reality is it never gets off the ground at all. News of the conspiracy is leaked to the region's governor, who arrests all of the conspirators on March 15th, 1789. The government will convict most of the plotters. It will send them into exile and into imprisonment. It sends them off to Africa, to Portuguese Asia. One man pays with his life, and that was the dragoon corporal, the dentist, Tiradentes. Joaquim José da Silva Xavier will pay with his life. He is hung in Rio de Janeiro in 1792. His body is quartered. Basically, they're going to show him and his body, the parts that they drag around all over the city, as an example. This is what happens if you conspire against the Portuguese crown. Well, the plotters are convicted. They're tried over a period of time. Tiradentes, and that's really all you need to know in terms of his name. You don't need to know his full name. But Tiradentes is convicted, pays with his life. While these plotters in Minas Gerais are being tried and convicted, the French Revolution breaks out in Europe in, of course, the same year, 1789. Suddenly, upper-class elites in Brazil don't want anything to do with political reform. You could lose your head. Things could get out of hand. And this is further reinforced 2 years later by the race war that breaks out in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, the Haitian Revolution that we've talked about before. Slaves rise up. They successfully throw the French off of the island of Saint-Domingue. Suddenly, masters in Brazil, really throughout the Americas, throughout the Caribbean as well, masters in the New World are terrified that there could be another Haiti. And of course, in the case of Brazil, in these mining regions and other parts of Brazil as well, black slaves outnumber the white masters by huge proportions. Beyond that, there's another side to all of this as well, in terms of suddenly elites in Brazil not being quite so concerned maybe for political change. And that is the fact that with the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s, suddenly Brazilian sugar, which has not gone away in the golden age, they're still making sugar. Brazilian sugar can basically take the place in the market that the sugar in Saint-Domingue was taking. And so many of them are starting to make money again in terms of your sugar planters and so forth. There's a variety of factors, but the main interpretive idea here for you is simply that in Brazil, the responses of elites to questions about political change, reform, and so forth will ultimately be limited by questions of race and questions of slavery. And this interpretive element is very, very important in terms of understanding ultimately how independence comes to Brazil in a very, very sort of conservative fashion. I've given you the example of the Minas conspiracy. I'm going to pause for just a moment, let you keep writing things down for just a second. A point I want to make here is that in addition to the Minas conspiracy in the 1780s, in the mining regions, you've got other examples of social unrest in Brazil that further reinforces this notion among elites that if you play with radical ideas, you could lose your head. To that end, let me take you to another part of Brazil, a slightly different period of time, roughly a decade later in the late 1790s, along the coasts of Brazil, Bahia, the old colonial capital. And let me show you where that is on the map. And here if we go to our map, you can see Bahia. This area up here, the old colonial capital, Salvador da Bahia, dates back to 1549 originally. This is where I want to take you to now. Let me take you then to the streets of Bahia in the year 1798, when you have another example of social unrest in Brazil that can be used to interpret how independence ultimately comes to Brazil in a very conservative fashion. Late 1798. An uprising takes place in the streets of Bahia. It is not an upper class kind of political uprising. It is an uprising of the lower classes. Today it's called the Tailors Revolt. It is led in part by a 27-year-old mulatto tailor, a man by the name of João de Deus, John of God. In Portuguese. And João de Deus, with lots of other people, including a number of slaves, women, the poor, urban artisans, and so forth, rise up in the streets of Bahia demanding change and patterning their revolt, their revolution, on a very radical kind of revolution, very different than the Minas conspiracy. They pattern their ideas on the French Revolution. Ultimately, they want to do away with slavery. They want to do away with the inequalities that exist in the world in which they lived. Well, the fact that they want to do away with slavery immediately cuts them off from all of the elites, from wealthy planters, from others. Even those that had liberal sympathies are not going to sympathize with these people, because doing away with slavery is considered, in this part of Brazil, of course, in all of Brazil really, extremely, extremely radical. Let me give you a sense of their radical ideas. I mentioned the fact that they're patterning their revolt on the French Revolution and so forth. When ultimately it's put down, João de Deus is put on trial, and ultimately he's convicted and hung. They say, what was this man trying to do? And people come and testify. And this is some of the testimony that can be found from the trial. What did João de Deus want to do? What was he proclaiming? Well, it was claimed that he was running through the streets in the midst of this uprising, shouting, "All Brazilians will become Frenchmen in order to live in equality and abundance. They will destroy the public officials, attack the monasteries, open the port, and reduce all to an entire revolution, so that all might be rich and taken out of poverty, and that the differences between white, black, and brown will be extinguished, and that all without discrimination will be admitted to positions and to occupations." In this revolt, not only are they going to do away with slavery, everybody is going to have a job, 100% employment if they succeed. Well, it's radical. It cuts off any sort of support from Brazilian elites and so forth. It's very, very quickly put down. It, again, brings up the fact that in Brazil, notions of change, political change, social change, everything has to be filtered through the concepts of race, through the institution of slavery and so forth. It makes for a very, very conservative sort of place. Well, given the conservative nature of Brazilian society on account of slavery and race, one might wonder whether independence will ever come to Brazil at all. Ultimately, independence does come to Brazil, but in a manner, again, that is very much a reflection of, in response to outside events. Events really that are first set into motion in late October 1807, when the French Emperor Napoleon, intent on European domination, sends French troops through Spain to invade Portugal. The Portuguese royal family is left at that point with a huge question. They are in no position to defend themselves against the French, against Napoleon's armies and so forth. What in the world are they to do? Well, they're left with this question. Ultimately, they make a very intriguing sort of decision, a choice. They are going to flee. The question becomes, where do you go? And ultimately, the answer will bring us to Brazilian independence. They decide to flee, not to Europe, anywhere in Europe at all, not to Britain, their allies, but rather in a series of British ships across the ocean to Brazil. Okay, I want to give you a quick sense of our cast of characters. Our first character is the Queen of Portugal at this point in time, the ruling monarch, only she's really not ruling. Her name is Maria, and you can see her here, right here. This is Dona Maria I. I mentioned that she's not ruling. The reason for that is fairly simple. She's nutty as a fruitcake. She's absolutely bonkers. She is mad. That being said, she got her madness honestly. She inherited it. Generations of uncles marrying nieces and uncles marrying nieces drove these people to have some genetic problems. She had them. She was crazy. Nutty as a fruitcake. If it wasn't her genetics enough, you might be mad too. She'd been forced to marry her uncle. So that's Dona Maria I. The person who's really calling the shots in Portugal at this point in time is her son. He's shown here. He is the Prince Regent. His name is João. He will later become João VI, and that's how I'll show him for you here as João VI. He's married to a Spanish princess. You can see his lovely bride here. Her name is Carlota Joaquina. I put Maria the Mad in between Carlota and João, among other things, because she came between them. They had all sorts of marital problems, arguably on account of this. You can see Carlota Joaquina with the lovely locket here of her husband, of her beloved. The reality is they utterly hate one another. It's said that many of the royal children look like other people. They didn't look like João. She herself has all sorts of interesting genetic issues. Among others, it said that she was very hairy. I'll just read you this description from the time written by a Portuguese courtier describing Carlota Joaquina. He says, she is soured, quote, with the features of a man, mustaches on her lips, hairs on her face, hairs on her hands, hairs every other place. This furry object was Dona Carlota Joaquina. So, give you a sense, this is our cast of characters. The royal family, their story is a story of a soap opera. You want to learn more about them, come take the History of Brazil, History 564, or come take History 206, Colonial Latin America. I teach the one in the fall, the other every spring. They're lovely opportunities to learn about very interesting people. Well, now that I've given you a sense of the cast of characters that we're talking about, I want to take you back to Lisbon, to Europe, really. October 18th, 1807, is the day that Napoleon's troops leave from France to cross into Spain to arrive to invade Portugal. Within a month, they're getting very, very close to Lisbon. First off, why are the French coming? Well, Napoleon, of course, wants to dominate all of Europe, but the Portuguese are a pawn in a much larger game. And the game for the French is really the English, and the Portuguese are English allies. Napoleon had demanded that the Portuguese royal family close off their ports to any sort of British trade. The Portuguese refused. Napoleon sends in his armies. Well, by middle of November, they're getting closer. By the end of November, they're very close. November 26th, 1807, is when the Portuguese royal family will ultimately flee. They've been planning this earlier. They've been putting everything into motion. The British ships have arrived to take them away. November 26th, the French are on the outskirts of Lisbon. You can hear the cannon shots. You can hear the musket fire and so forth. The royal family has to leave. It's said that it was a rainy day. The rain was coming down, and the people of Lisbon watched as their crazy queen, as her son, the Prince Regent, as his wife, the Spanish princess Carlota Joaquina, and the rest of the family load up and sail away. It's said that João, a very large man at this moment of time, tells the people of Lisbon, I'm going away now. but it's to save the empire. One day I will return. They watch him board the ship. They watch the family sail away. The French troops come in at this moment and are taking pot shots at the British ships as the Portuguese royal family leaves their people, the people of Lisbon, the people of Portugal, to abandon Europe entirely and go off to Brazil. Well, the journey to Brazil was not without incident. There are far more people on these ships than should have ever been put on the ships. There's not enough supplies. You've got the royal family there. What are you to do? Eventually, they end up with head lice. The queen, or the Princess Regent Carlota Joaquina, is forced to shave her head because of the lice that she gets on these ships. There's not enough water to go around. A British merchant who was part of all of this, a British sailor who was looking after the royal family, that later described it in these terms. I'm going to give it to you like a British sailor might. He writes, "Oh, it were a nightmare. We had not enough mattresses or blankets to go around, so most of us spent the cold nights in the stuffy hold. Water was our principal need. Oh, we thought about it all the time. The food became worse every day, and we had so little of it as to fear for our lives. In fact, our situation was so horrible that I would not wish it upon me most hated enemy." Anyway, gives you a sense of what the royal family went through. Eventually, January 21st, 1808, they arrive in Bahia, the old colonial capital. By this point in time, Rio de Janeiro is the capital of colonial Brazil. They arrive first in Bahia. Eventually, they go on from there to Rio de Janeiro. By the time they get into Rio, they have to put the queen, Maria, in utter seclusion. She is just nutty by this point in time. The journey across the ocean has not done anything for her sanity. So she's put into seclusion. It's João who is really running things, the Prince Regent. João, it's said, when they arrive in Rio, immediately falls in love with the city. His wife, the Spanish princess, Carlota Joaquina, is said to have hated it. There's another member of the royal family in all of this as well. His name is Pedro. And Pedro was Carlota and João's little 8-year-old boy. He had lots of curly brown hair. The locals, it's said, will fall in love with the little boy. They think he's an absolute darling when he gets off of the ship in Rio de Janeiro. And little Pedro, the little 8-year-old, will go on to grow up in Rio de Janeiro. Well, returning to kind of larger events here, the local elites in Rio are suddenly find themselves in a very, very powerful position. They are in a position to offer housing, to offer clothing, to offer all sorts of things for the royal family, for all of the courtiers and others who have accompanied them to Brazil. And so they are in a position of power. The crown really is going to owe them, because the crown arrives with very, very little. In terms of royal government, it will thereafter begin to function out of Rio de Janeiro. The colony has now become the center of the empire. New courts will be established. The police, new police system, institutions will be established. The treasury will begin to function out of Rio. The crown brings with it archives, and so all of the archives of Portugal end up in Rio de Janeiro. The crown establishes a botanical garden. The National Library dates to this time. A bank, the Banco do Brasil, the Bank of Brazil, dates to this time. Prior to this point in time, there is no bank in Brazil. There's a medical school established, an aqueduct to bring in fresh water to the city and so forth. Rio de Janeiro, over the course of the next decade, will be completely transformed. Well, I mentioned the fact that local elites find themselves in a position really of power in order to get local elites to go along with everything, to give him what he needs. João, the Prince Regent, will award honorific titles of nobility and so forth. He'll also do this kind of thing to raise funds. He'll make so-and-so a knight, or give military titles of knighthood, all sorts of things. He needs cash. He needs funds and so forth. Portugal, the Portuguese Empire, again, is now functioning out of Rio de Janeiro. So I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm going to go on fairly quickly here, but this just gives you kind of a sense of everything being turned on its head. The colony is now the center of the empire, the old center in the old world. Little tiny Portugal on the very edge of Western Europe has now become the colony of its own colony. Well, I gave you a sense of all of this. I want to bring the British in here as well. This is important in terms of interpretively understanding how everything plays out. In reality, it is the British that were keeping the Portuguese crown alive at this point in time. It was British ships that had brought the Portuguese across the ocean. It was British resources that were also helping them set up in Brazil and so forth. Just like the local Luso-Brazilian elites in Rio and other places in Brazil, the British want a reward for what they're doing to prop up the Portuguese crown as well. Ultimately, thereafter, in 1810, a British envoy in Rio will negotiate an important trade treaty with the Portuguese. I don't have time to talk about it here, but trade with Britain and Brazil will increase dramatically thereafter. So again, another example of transformation. There is another factor in terms of Luso-British relations, and Luso is just the term for the Portuguese. Another factor in terms of Portuguese-British relations. Portuguese-British relations in Brazil will be complicated by abolitionist attempts in Britain to end the slave trade. We talked about this in class last time. The story of Thomas Clarkson and the end of slavery, the end of the slave trade initially in the British world. And as you'll recall, the slave trade is outlawed by the British Parliament in 1807. Now, the British outlaw this, but it's not enough to outlaw it for the British world. They outlaw it for everybody else as well. They say, we have the most powerful navy, we're in a position to stop the trade, and we don't want anybody participating in it. This casts a very long shadow on Luso-British relations. The British begin to put tremendous pressure thereafter. And of course, this all happens initially in 1807, so everything's happening at the same time. The British put tremendous pressure on the Portuguese crown to end Portuguese participation with the slave trade, to stop bringing African slaves from Africa across the Atlantic to Brazil. The Portuguese crown really owes its very life, its existence at this point in time, to the same British world, the British Empire. What is the crown to do? Well, ultimately, the Portuguese crown agrees to cut back on the slave trade, to eventually abolish Portuguese participation in it, to stop bringing slaves to Brazil. What is the upshot of this? What is the consequence of this? Well, it angers local elites in Brazil, who for hundreds of years, their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers, generation after generation, they have relied on slavery, whether it be sugar plantations, whether it be the gold in the interior of Brazil, whatever you're talking about. Brazil has been slavery. Slavery has been Brazil. These local elites then become angered. They depend on the slave trade for labor. They believe that they need it to survive. Consequently, notions of Brazilian independence, of nationalism and so forth, will increasingly come to be associated with a defense of slavery. So it gives you a sense of connections in terms of the British with all of this. Well, let's go back in the case of the Portuguese world. Let me just give you kind of a quick sense of the series of events that ultimately lead to Brazilian independence. 1814-ish, 1813, 1815-ish, Napoleon has finally been defeated in Europe. He's had his Waterloo. The British have dominated. They've conquered. France isn't in a position to control things anymore. Suddenly, the King of Portugal, or I should say the Prince Regent, his mother's still alive. She's still as crazy as ever. The Prince Regent João is in a position to bring the royal family back to Portugal from Brazil. They've spent the last decade in Brazil. Napoleon's been defeated. Rather than returning to Brazil, however, or returning to Portugal, however, João does something completely different. In 1815, he raises Brazil to the status of co-kingdom with Portugal. Not only is Brazil no longer a de facto colony of Portugal, now it is in equal terms politically with Portugal. Portugal is essentially a de facto colony of Brazil. 1816, a year later, Maria, the crazy queen, finally dies. The former Prince Regent, João, will be crowned Dom João VI, again on account of the death of his mother, Dona Maria the First. By this point in time, the little boy, the little curly-head 8-year-old little boy, he's in his late teens. He's grown up most of his life in Brazil and so forth. They need to find a princess for the kid to marry and to continue on the royal line and so forth. There are no royal princesses in Brazil for him to marry. They start to negotiate with different European powers. Eventually, they find an Austrian princess, a girl, a young girl, by the name of Leopoldina, who comes to the New World to marry the Pedro, who's now all grown up. An important point to make in all of this is that Austria is actually a very important power at this point in time. This was a real kind of coup for the Portuguese royal family to get their son to marry an Austrian princess. There's all sorts of stories of this girl. I'll share some maybe if we have time in the pictures. Come take, again, the history of Brazil, History 564. We go into much more detail with all of these stories. Anyway, Austrian princess comes to the New World to marry the heir to the Portuguese throne. Well, meanwhile, in Europe, events are changing. The Portuguese have been waiting for their king to return. He is not returning. He is not returning. He is not returning. What in the world are they to do? In the interim, they've become the colony of their very colony. They begin to make demands. The Portuguese, essentially the Portuguese parliament meets, what were called the courts. They meet and they demand that João return to Portugal. They say, if you don't, we will find another king to rule us. Maybe we'll declare a republic, but we're going to have change. Ultimately then, João, way off in Brazil, is left with a huge question. What is he to do? In 1821, he decides that he will return to Portugal, again, largely in response to the demands of the Portuguese court. A new parliament that has been established in Portugal in 1820, they've threatened to dethrone him if he does not return. It's said that upon leaving Brazil, Rio, with all of its beauty, he breaks into tears. He just cries and cries. Carlota Joaquina, on the other hand, his wife, the Spanish princess, takes her shoes off, drops them overboard. She is wiping away the very, very dust off of her feet. These are the two that return to the old world. Who do they leave behind? They leave young Pedro. He is left behind to serve as a prince regent, to govern Brazil, this co-kingdom, in the name of his father. And it's said that his father, João, had said to him, taken him aside before the royal family leaves, and had said to Pedro, ultimately, they know I'm an old man, and they're going to want you to come back too if they demand that you return. Don't, my son. Stay in the New World. The future of our house, the House of Bragança, lies in Brazil, again, where you can have everything in abundance. Well, João goes back. He goes off, back off to the old world, to Lisbon. When he arrives in Lisbon, he finds that everything is completely changed. The country is basically run now as a kind of constitutional monarchy. The powers that he would have enjoyed if he had remained there, they are largely gone. Well, a General Assembly is called. The General Assembly looks at João, their king. They know he's getting old. He's robust. He's a huge man. They're just waiting for the fellow to die. They know that as soon as he does, his mantle falls upon his son, who's remained behind in Brazil. And so they demand that Pedro also return to Portugal. Basically what's going on here is this kind of constitutional monarchy that's been established in Portugal. They've got all sorts of liberal ideas for their day in terms of, rule and power in Portugal. But they're very, very conservative when it comes to Brazil. And essentially they want to recolonize Brazil. They want to bring the prince, in this case again, the Prince Regent, who has become the Prince Regent, Pedro. They want to bring him home to Portugal. Well, things will come to a head. In late 1821, the courts demand that Pedro return to Portugal. On January 9th, 1822, he responds. He is said to have said, Fico, a very strong Portuguese verb in the first person. I am staying. Fico, I am staying. Thereafter, Pedro will send away troops that are still loyal to Portugal. He'll create a new ministry. He'll basically begin to put all of the pieces into place so that he can remain behind in Brazil. Lisbon will subsequently send dispatches to Brazil, accusing Pedro of treason. And then everything really comes to a head in early September, September 7th, 1822, when Pedro camped on the banks of a stream in São Paulo, the Ipiranga, and receives news of this latest dispatch that he has been accused of treason. He declares Brazilian independence. He says, Independencia or morte, independence or death. Ultimately, he receives a lot of support in Brazil. Independence will be achieved with relatively little infighting in all of this. The coming of independence to Brazil is in many ways the story of a new arm of the Portuguese royal family establishing itself in the New World and going on to rule in the New World a Brazilian empire over the course of the 19th century. Well, I've got a bunch of pictures to show you. I've talked a whole bunch here. I'm going to pause before I show you the pictures for just a moment so you can get a sense of things. You can finish taking your notes. We'll come back after the pictures. I have a final couple of thoughts in terms of the significance, really, of all of this, not only for today, but moving forward to our next class meeting where we'll talk about the coming of abolition. So let's go to the pictures. Come back in just a moment for some final thoughts. Well, we're running out of time, but I want to give you just a real quick sense in terms of some pictures that can help illustrate much of what we're talking about here. To begin with, I want to use some images that speak to the Minas conspiracy, the Inconfidencia Mineira. Today, this is how Tiradentes, Joaquim José da Silva Xavier, is portrayed. Again, he's the character that loses his life for conspiring to overthrow the Portuguese crown, establish a republic based on a North American kind of model in the heart of Minas Gerais, in Ouro Preto, in the late 1780s. The reality is nobody knows what he really looked like. This is an image that's done in the middle of the 19th century after Brazil had gotten its independence, and Brazilians themselves were trying, as it were, to find the roots of an independent Portuguese-speaking empire in the New World. They pluck Tiradentes from an obscure past and raise him to the father of Brazilian nationalism in independent Brazil. How do they portray him? Well, who does he look like? They portray him as a Christ-like figure, and you see it in the very image there. Nobody really has any idea what the man looked like. Here is how he's being portrayed generations later as a Christ, as a martyr. And you see that here. This is another image. This is a bronze sculpture from 1922. It's Tiradentes as he's about to be drawn and quartered. He's a martyr for a future independent Brazil. And another image here. This is a painting from 1893 by Pedro Américo. It's Tiradentes' death. And again, you can see him portrayed as a Christ-like figure. He becomes a symbol later on, generations later, of the beginning of Brazilian independence, of nationalism, for Brazil being separate from Portugal. Well, the story of Brazilian independence ultimately is a story that is intertwined with the worlds of the French and of the British and so forth. This is the storming of the Bastille. We talked about this when we talked about the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution. Another image here. On our left, you can see the Haitian Revolution, black slaves having overthrown the French, stringing up Napoleon's army and hanging them, so forth. On the right, all the heads are falling with the guillotine and so forth. It's images like this that terrify Brazilian masters, that give Brazil a very kind of conservative bent. Ultimately, for independence to come to Brazil, outside factors have to come into play. What are the outside factors? Well, in no small part, it's Napoleon. Ultimately, Brazilian independence is brought on, in part, the beginning of it all, when Napoleon invades Portugal in late 1807. The royal family is forced to flee. Again, I've already told you a little bit about the royal family. You can see we've got João here on our left, the nutty queen in the middle, Carlota Joaquina on our right. Lovely characters. The other character in all of this that I mentioned for a little bit, and that'll play an important role later on, is Pedro. And here you can see a young Pedro. He will later become Pedro I, Dom Pedro I, the first emperor of Brazil. When he arrives in Rio, however, he's just a curly-headed little 8-year-old boy. He'll grow up in Brazil. In terms of our other cast of characters, you can see them grow old. Here is João VI, this king, much older João VI. Here is Carlota Joaquina. I've already given you the description of what she is said to have looked like. And the lovely couple here, they fought. They nearly killed each other on occasion. They were a very dysfunctional family. The Rio de Janeiro of this period of time is shown here. These are images that were done by a Frenchman visiting Brazil in the early 19th century during this period when the royal family was there in exile. It's the Rio of the 19th century. The Rio of today is, of course, much larger, much bigger, and so forth. Another image, really, of today. But the beauty of Rio, Sugarloaf Mountain in the background, the great hills, and so forth, the Corcovado, not the statue of Christ on the Corcovado, but the hill itself, all of that was there at the time. Rio is a postcard, a picture postcard of a city. This is the city that it says João fell in love with, that Pedro grew up in, and so forth. Just some other images here. The beauty of Rio of the time. It's just a lovely city today. You can see it here. One of the most dangerous cities in the world. So don't go out at night. Botanical gardens are built, palaces are built. Here you can see the royal palace. Here you can see the botanical gardens. Rio is transformed over the course of this period of time. The royal family itself is transformed ultimately as well. Finally, 1816, crazy Maria dies. João, who has been running everything for decades, finally gets to become king, not only in fact, but in name. Here you can see his acclamation, the acclamation of João VI in 1816, all of the people celebrating in the streets. Well, by this point in time, little Pedro, shown on our left, has grown up into big Pedro, shown on our right. They need to find someone for him to marry. Who do they find? Here you can see another image of Pedro. They find a lovely Austrian princess. Dona Leopoldina is shown here, both on our left and our right. She arrives in Rio to great fanfare and so forth, journeys across the ocean to marry her prince. She's an interesting character. I'm running out of time, but I've got to read you this little thing that she writes to her aunt as she's making her journey to the new world to marry Pedro. She writes, "My dear aunt," I should say aunt, "you may believe me to be eager in obeying the excellent advice you gave me, for I shall seek my happiness by contributing to that of my future husband, and fulfilling the duties which my new station will impose upon me. I confess that the sacrifice I must bring in leaving my own family, perhaps forever, will be very painful, but this alliance pleases my father, and the parting will be made easier by the realization that I have complied with his wishes. I am convinced that some particular providence directs the fate of princesses, demanding that we bow to the best interests of the state." Quite the character. I'll show you here again. Dona Leopoldina, Austrian princess, comes to the New World to marry Pedro, a Portuguese prince. And here again you can see her arriving. The letters that she writes home, it's like reading something out of a Disneyland, a Disney kind of movie in terms of a princess. She says, "I believe that Providence directs the fate of princesses." Well, it may direct the fate of princesses. It does not direct the fate of the Portuguese royal family. João is going to be deposed in Portugal unless he returns. Here you can see they boarded the ship. It said he's in tears. Carlota Joaquina is just happy as all get out to get out of Brazil. She takes her shoes and throws them overboard. She's wiping the dust of Brazil off her feet. Ultimately, of course, it's not enough for João to have returned to be king of Portugal. The Portuguese courts want his son to come back as well. They accuse him ultimately of treason when he says he is going to stay, and so they attempt to arrest him. On September 22nd, 1822, João responds with his famous shout from the Ipiranga. Grito do Ipiranga, he says, independence or death. And that's the beginning of Brazilian independence, September 7th, 1822, with a member of the royal family declaring an independent Brazil and establishing himself as an emperor in Portuguese America. Well, let me, by way of conclusion, just give you a quick sense of the rest of the story. What is the significance of all of this? Well, the rest of the story. Dom Pedro I will serve as the first emperor of Brazil. He will rule really for the next decade. Thereafter, he'll be succeeded by his son, Dom Pedro II. He carries on the name of his father, who will rule through nearly the entire 19th century, through 1889. Brazil then will have established itself as an independent empire in the New World. It's cut off its ties to Portugal. It is independent. And yet it's maintained vestiges of the old colonial system that had existed before. We still have a monarchy. We have an empire. We have emperors. And these emperors are arguably the heirs to the throne in Portugal, who've abandoned Portugal entirely for the New World. It's a very, very interesting story. The monarchical system that exists in Brazil is not the only vestige of the old colonial world that Brazil had previously been a part of. The institution of slavery very much survives independence and will flourish over the course of much of the 19th century. The story of abolition coming to Brazil then is in many ways a completely separate story. We'll talk about that in class next time. That all being said, you've listened to me for a long period of time. It's time for me to go play. I suggest that you do the same thing as well. It's freezing cold outside, but you might as well enjoy it. There is sledding at Young Library. I hate to think of all the other crazy things you guys might do with the snow. I've heard stories of students climbing on top of their fraternity houses and trying to ski off. Don't do that. I'm nearly ready to go. And like any good storyteller on television, I need to have my song. I will see you next time. Oh, one more thing. Your papers, they're still due on Monday. Have fun. Go sledding. Bye-bye.
That wasn't much.